That night, I had this incredibly strange dream. It was packaged like a piece of fiction, but I still couldn't stop myself from reading every single word of this novel. Don't embarrass yourself here, Elias. You've never really been a part of this family anyway. My mother said that to me right across the long dining table at the country club, holding a crystal champagne flute. It was during the reception after my grandfather's funeral. She actually had this elegant little smile on her face, and every relative at the table heard her loud and clear. My grandfather's ashes hadn't even been laid to rest in the family plot yet. Right after that, my father announced to everyone in that tone of his that no one ever questions that grandfather's log cabin up in the Adirondacks, and the family trust fund would all go to my brother, the real oldest son. I was getting absolutely nothing because I never truly belonged to them. My aunt just stared awkwardly at her plate, and my father casually poured himself some more bourbon. My brother reached over, squeezed my mother's hand, and looked at me with this complicated expression, like just breathing the same air as this family was some kind of sin. I didn't argue. I didn't cry either. I've had 32 years of practice keeping a straight face. But what nobody at that table knew was that inside the breast pocket of my suit, a sealed manila envelope was sitting quietly. It was a document my grandfather had secretly arranged and paid for on his deathbed, leaving strict legal instructions that I was the only person on earth with the right to open it. In a few weeks, my mother would be in a conference room at the family lawyer's office, screaming her lungs out, begging him to undo everything. But that night, she was still completely sure she had won. And the quietest person at that table was actually counting down the days in his head until their precious pride came crashing down. For over 30 years, I was the misfit, the mistake of a son in a perfect family, and right then I finally decided to stop trying to fix the crack. My grandfather's name was Harrison Thorne. He passed away from lung cancer on a Tuesday in late October. When I got the call, I was sitting in my office in downtown Chicago, working as a forensic accountant, staring at a computer screen auditing the offshore accounts of someone I'd never even met. It felt like a sick joke my life had been playing on me all along. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's go back to that country club reception, because that was the exact moment when everything that was already hanging by a thread completely fell apart. It was an exclusive club in Chicago's wealthy North Shore. William and Margaret Thorne, my parents, had been married for exactly 40 years. They were the kind of respectable couple who hung a custom oil painting in their mansion's entryway that read, "Family is everything." But their definition of family had some incredibly strict, exclusive rules. Our family tradition was to have a rigid seating arrangement at the table for major events, and my tradition was to always sit at the very edge of the long table, right next to the kitchen doors where the servers came out. It was far enough from the inner circle to be easily forgotten, but close enough if they needed someone to pass the pepper shaker. My brother, Preston, sat dead center. That was his permanent throne. Preston is 3 years older than me. He's tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and a former Ivy League quarterback, while I have dark hair, a lean build, and a very quiet, cautious personality. Growing up, he was the pride and joy whose trophies filled an entire display wall, the one my father took out to play golf, the one my mother always called my sweet boy. I, on the other hand, only ever heard my mother use my full name when she was disappointed in me, which was pretty much the case most of the time we interacted. Within an hour that night, the conversation naturally turned to the estate. Grandfather owned a massive log cabin up in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. It was the Thorne family's summer sanctuary for 3 generations, complete with a private dock grandfather built with his own hands. On top of that, there was a massive family trust. In a family like ours that prides itself on being old money, talking about exact dollar amounts is considered incredibly tacky, but everyone at the table knew the math. That cabin was worth way more than my parents' mansion in Chicago, and everyone just assumed Preston was the sole rightful heir. Preston is the oldest grandson, my mother said, looking around the table, but also kind of talking to the air. Harrison definitely would have wanted the property in steady hands. Steady hands. I stared at my hands, gripping my glass of ice water, saying absolutely nothing. That's when I made a mistake. I casually mentioned that I had already spoken with the attorney handling grandfather's estate. I didn't mean anything by it. The lawyer was the one who called me. But the entire table went dead silent instantly, and the smile on my mother's face froze. That was the exact second she used that high and mighty nasty tone to say, "You've never really been a part of this family anyway." Before the story goes any further, you probably need to know a little bit about me. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 32 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a major firm, which basically means my day job is digging through messy, complicated family business accounts. I look past the numbers to see human nature, watching how money can turn blood relatives into bitter enemies. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Chicago with a retired greyhound named Bullet. The only person in this world I truly loved who shared my last name was my grandfather. If you're listening to this right now, and you were also that kid who was merely tolerated instead of wanted, if you've ever sat at a family dinner feeling like an outsider who just happens to share the same blood, then your gut probably already knows where this story is heading. But even if you don't know the exact details yet, stick with me, because the details are how the whole game gets flipped upside down. If this is hitting close to home for you, do me a favor and let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. I really want to know that I'm not the only person in the world who learned how to quietly take a seat at a table where they were never really welcome. Now let me tell you what took me 30 years to finally understand. I don't have one single massive traumatic memory of being unwanted. That's not how it works. It's the suffocating weight of thousands of tiny moments piled on top of each other. I remember being 10 years old and coming home with a first-place medal from the state math competition. My mother just glanced at it, said, "That's nice," and immediately turned around to ask Preston if he was tired from rowing practice. I remember how in every single family photo, Preston was always right in the middle, flanked by our parents, while I was always standing off to the side, looking like a neighbor's kid who accidentally wandered into the shot. I remember my father teaching Preston how to drive up and down the estate's driveway, but when it was my turn 2 years later, he just tossed me a check and told me to sign up for driving school, solely to avoid sitting alone in a car with me. Over the years, the words they used to describe me shifted, but the core message never changed. Elias is always in his own world. Elias has been independent since he was a kid. You know how Elias is, he doesn't need anyone to worry about him. They used deliberate neglect and exclusion to force an independent personality onto me, and then turned around and praised me for not needing them. The cruelest part of all was that I actually believed them. I spent years thinking I was just naturally unlovable. I thought there was some kind of genetic flaw in my soul that even the mother who gave birth to me could sense, but I just couldn't see. In my 20s, I spent my own hard-earned money on years of therapy, trying to find that flaw. I wanted to know what exactly made me the son who was tolerated instead of chosen. The only person in this world who ever made me feel completely unhesitatingly chosen was Harrison. The way my grandfather looked at me was like I was an answer he'd been searching for his entire life. When I was 12, he taught me how to play chess on the deck of that log cabin. He would cleverly let me win, timing it just right so I'd feel accomplished but could still sense his effort. He told me I had the same sharp eyes he had when he was young. He told me I had his exact stubborn streak, the kind of good quality that helps you survive when things get tough. Around him, I never felt like the kid on the sidelines. But grandfather lived several states away in upstate New York, and my mother completely controlled our family calendar. After I turned 14, the summer trips to the cabin became fewer and farther between. Eventually, their family vacations left me out entirely. By the time I turned 19 and went away for college, I had pretty much left that house for good. There was no running away, no slamming doors, and no big dramatic declaration of cutting ties. That wasn't our family's style. We Thornes used politeness and the silent treatment to end things. I finished college, got my CPA license, found a high-paying job in a city far away from them, and naturally stopped going home for ordinary holidays. I only showed up for Christmas and major occasions, sending a few cards the rest of the year. I made sure to call grandfather every single Sunday. Distance feels a lot safer than a dinner table. At a table, I was the unwanted guest who wouldn't leave. But from a distance, I was at least a son on paper. That seemed to be the only way they knew how to love me. Theoretically, from far away, as long as I didn't annoy them by actually needing anything. For about 10 years, that was our unspoken agreement. I built a small, quiet life for myself. I was incredibly good at my job. I had 2 best friends I'd trust with my life, and a dog who was willing to put up with me. I basically gave up trying out for the role of my mother's son. I told myself I was at peace with the fact that I just didn't belong. I almost believed it too, until my grandfather got sick, and the thin layer of peace I'd worked so hard to build started crumbling from the weakest cracks. Harrison was diagnosed last fall. And the way I found out was the same as always, late and completely by accident. Preston posted a photo on social media of the whole family at the Adirondack cabin with the caption, "Precious time with Grandpa." Nobody told me that time had become so precious, and nobody invited me. That Sunday, I called Grandfather like I always did, carefully asking how he was doing. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then he said, "Elias, fly up here next weekend. Just you. Don't tell your mother." Don't tell your mother. I should have known right then that the gears had already started turning. The next Saturday, I drove deep into the Adirondack Mountains. The cabin smelled just like I remembered. Pine needles and old leather. He had lost a lot of weight, and his movements were slow, but his eyes were still sharp, full of mischief, and truly seeing me. We played a game of chess. He let me win the first round. Then he stopped pretending, laughed out loud, and checkmated me 3 times in a row. During that long, melancholy afternoon, he pushed the chess pieces aside and looked at me with that gaze, the one that made me feel like I was the answer. "Elias," he said, "I have to ask you something, and to give an old man some peace of mind, I need you not to lie to me." I told him okay. "All these years, your mother and your father, how have they actually made you feel?" he asked. "Tell me the truth, cut through the polite nonsense." Maybe it was because he knew he was dying, or maybe it was because absolutely nobody else had ever cared about how I felt. But I told him the truth. I told him that my entire life I felt like a jacket a guest forgot in the coat room. I told him about all those photos where I was always on the very edge. I told him I'd spent 15 years and a small fortune on therapy, trying to figure out what was wrong with me. He listened to every single word without moving a muscle. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down his wrinkled old face, but his voice was incredibly steady. What he said next was the spark that set everything on fire. "There has never been anything wrong with you," he said. "I think I finally know why they did this. Honestly, I've suspected it for a long time. I just didn't have the proof. I couldn't tear this family apart based on a gut feeling." I asked him what he meant by that. He took my hand. His palm was as rough as sandpaper, and on his ring finger he wore the emerald family ring he had never once taken off. "I've already handled it," he said. "Once I'm gone, Thomas Vance, the attorney, is going to call you. Not your mother, you. He has something to give you, and you have to open it completely alone. And Elias, no matter what's written inside, it will never change the fact that you are the grandson I am most proud of." I begged him to tell me right then and there. He just shook his head. "If I tell you now," he said, "you'll waste my last few months on Earth staring daggers at your mother instead of spending time with me. Just let me have you for a little while longer." So, I listened to him. Over that winter, I flew back up there 4 more times without my parents knowing. We played chess until he was too exhausted to even lift the pieces, and then we just sat quietly by the fireplace. He never explained what he meant that day, not even once, until a Tuesday in late October when he passed away in his sleep. On his nightstand was the Sunday card I had sent him. The funeral was held the morning after that country club reception where my mother told me I wasn't really family. Thomas Vance caught up with me on the grass behind the church. At that moment, my mother was receiving condolences from friends and relatives like a grieving queen, with Preston standing right by her side in a sharp, custom black suit. Thomas was an old lawyer with kind but exhausted eyes, and he'd been the executor of my grandfather's estate for over 30 years. "Mr. Thorne," he said, dropping his voice to a whisper. "Elias, your grandfather left very specific instructions. Can you come to my office alone before the family will reading on Thursday?" Across the lawn, I saw my mother staring right at us while we talked. I could feel her gaze like a cold hand gripping the back of my neck. I told him, "I'll be there." "There's an envelope," he added, his voice dropping even lower. He was incredibly strict about this. "It can only be handed to you and you have to open it yourself. He also told me to give you this right now." He pressed a folded note into my palm. It was written in my grandfather's own handwriting from the week before he died. I waited until I was sitting safely inside my car to open it. Written in his shaky script were just 3 lines. "My Elias, the truth is heavy, but it will keep your feet on the ground. You will know what to do because you are the only one among them who is never cruel. Love always, Harrison." I sat there in the church parking lot and read that note exactly 11 times. Then I drove home and didn't sleep a wink. By Thursday, I was finally going to uncover the trap my grandfather had laid, using the very last conscious moments of his life. Thomas Vance's law office smelled like old paper and black coffee. He had me sit down, crossed his hands on the desk, and handed me the first piece of the puzzle. "Your grandfather changed his will last October," he said calmly. "It was done right here, with 2 witnesses present, and his mental state was certified as completely sound. I went out of my way to arrange a psychiatric evaluation because I figured someone in the family might try to contest it. The way the Adirondack cabin and the Thorne Trust are being inherited is completely different from what your parents think." I asked him how they were being passed down. "They go to his direct biological descendants," he said, pronouncing every word clearly. He was incredibly specific about the phrasing, and he attached a prerequisite. He slid a thick manila envelope across the desk. The seal had a tamper-evident label from a major genomic analysis laboratory. "He hired this lab last September. He told me to keep it safe and hand it to you completely intact after he passed. He said you had to be the first person in the world to read this report." I asked him what was inside. "I don't know the results," Thomas said. "I only know what he ordered. It's a DNA genomic analysis comparing grandfather to grandson relationships. This is a top-tier, court-admissible lab. He provided his own sample, along with 2 others." My hands turned ice-cold instantly. I asked him whose samples the other 2 were. "Yours," he said, "and your brother's." I want to be completely honest about how I felt at that exact second, because it wasn't a feeling of victory. And it wasn't even fear. It was a massive wave of vertigo. For 32 years, I had been totally convinced that I was the broken, defective one. And now, my grandfather was reaching out from the grave to tell me, maybe the problem was never me. And he had used the last of his strength to make sure I had ironclad proof. I asked Thomas how grandfather had even gotten our samples. The lawyer almost cracked a faint smile. "Your brother gave your grandfather a custom set of golf tees and cigars for Christmas the year before last, and your grandfather secretly saved the half-smoked cigar Preston left behind. As for you, remember last fall when you accidentally chipped your glass while drinking whiskey on the deck and cut your lip? He wrapped up that blood-stained glass and saved it." It all came rushing back. I remembered bleeding a little, and how he had nervously held an ice cube against my lip for the longest time. My stubborn, brilliant, dying grandfather had been quietly gathering evidence while helping me stop the bleeding. I opened the envelope right there in his office. Thomas offered to step out, but I asked him to stay. The report was a solid 4 pages long, packed with dense medical and biological jargon. But the lab had very thoughtfully put a summary in plain English inside a gray box right on the first page. I had to stare at that box 3 times before my eyes could focus. The paternal and autosomal lineage analysis yields a definitive conclusion. Elias Thorne perfectly matches the deceased, Harrison Thorne, on the expected Y chromosome markers and ancestral genetic markers, consistent with a direct biological grandfather-to-grandson relationship. Probability of biological relationship exceeds 99.9%. Then came the second name. Preston Thorne is excluded from genetic marker compatibility with the deceased, Harrison Thorne. This profile does not align with a biological relationship transmitted through the Thorne paternal lineage and the maternal lineage of Margaret Thorne. Using incredibly strict legal and medical terms, the report spelled it out perfectly clear. Preston could not possibly be the biological child of William and Margaret Thorne, which meant he wasn't Harrison Thorne's biological grandson. I read it a 4th time. Eventually, I had to ask Thomas to read it out loud because I couldn't trust my own eyes anymore. Preston, the golden boy, the oldest son, the real heir, my mother's pride and joy, wasn't even my parents' biological child. And I, the misfit who never really belonged, was the only true biological bloodline my grandfather had left in this world. I asked Thomas the only question that mattered. "Does my mother know about this report?" "No," he said. "Nobody knows, just you. Those were Harrison's strict orders. He wanted you to decide exactly what to do with it." I sat in that quiet office, clutching a few thin pieces of paper, but those papers instantly rewrote the entire logic of my 32 years on Earth. I finally understood that everything that happened at that long dining table was never about who I was. It was about who Preston wasn't and who exactly knew that secret. For 2 whole weeks, I didn't say a word to anyone. I had to map out every single inch of the battlefield before I stepped onto it, because in my career, I'd seen way too many people ruin their lives by acting on information they only half understood. So, I used my best professional skill. I started a forensic investigation. The first thing I did was verify the lab. Thomas gave me the chain of custody documents. I called the lab directly, using my real credentials as a forensic accountant handling an estate trust, to confirm court-admissible results. The lab was totally legit, with top-tier AABB legal accreditation. It was the kind of place whose results are taken by a court with zero questions asked. My grandfather hadn't bought some gimmicky drugstore test kit. He spent big money on the real deal, the kind of stuff that holds up in front of a judge. The second thing I did was put together a timeline, because a lab test can only tell you what is true, but it can't tell you why. And before I sat down across from my mother, I had to find that why. I started digging into Preston's birth records. I'd never had a single reason to look at them closely before. Preston was born in the spring of 1988, and I was born in the late summer of 1991. Growing up, the story we always heard was exactly the same. William and Margaret got married young, had 2 sons within 3 years, the perfect picture book American family. But when I re-examined that history through the lens of an auditor, the once flawless story started looking full of holes. It's just that before now, nobody had ever dared to shine a flashlight on the lies that fed their precious vanity. My parents got married in 1985. My mother always had this dramatic sob story routine about how she had severe complications giving birth to Preston, nearly died, and was told by doctors she could probably never get pregnant again. It became the family's flawless excuse for why there was a 3-year gap before I came along. I believed that story my entire life. Now I was putting it under a magnifying glass. I dialed the only person who might actually talk, my mother's estranged sister, my Aunt Vivian. Aunt Vivian ran an art gallery in Santa Fe, and she had always been a little warmer to me than the rest of the family. It was a casual kind of warmth, like a bystander who saw the truth but didn't want to start a war. I told her I was helping sort out grandfather's messy estate trust, and that I needed to verify some old family dates for the tax filings. A perfectly legal-sounding lie. She was happy to catch up. And in the middle of our casual conversation, she handed me the first thread that would unravel everything. "Oh, those years were such a circus," she said. "Your mom and William were desperate for an heir right after they got married, but William apparently had some medical issues. You know how your father is, completely eaten up by pride, so he threw absolute fits about it. Your mother was practically having a breakdown. Then, out of nowhere, Preston was born. A total miracle, as your grandfather used to say. Margaret went away to a health spa for 6 whole months that spring, and when she came back, she had a baby in her arms. In those old money circles back then, as long as the surface looked perfect, nobody asked rude questions." I forced my voice to stay steady. I asked her where this health spa was. "Somewhere down south, Texas, I think. William used to have business partners down there." There was a brief pause on the line. "Why do you ask, honey? Is something wrong?" I told her it was nothing, just checking dates for the IRS. We talked a bit more about the Adirondack cabin. I thanked her, and I hung up. I sat there in my chair, my heart pounding so hard it felt like someone was punching my chest. Away for 6 whole months, coming back with a baby, a husband's secret medical issue, a sudden miracle. I'm not a private investigator, but I make a living auditing complex offshore trusts. I know exactly what kind of tracks a family leaves behind when they try to rewrite their own history. A couple who can't have kids, who value male pride and social standing above life itself. A wife who vanishes for a season and returns with a baby boy, and then everyone collectively calls it a miracle so nobody dares use a different word. I almost stopped right there. I want you to know that I was holding a gut feeling, a dead man's note, an aunt's fuzzy memory, and a DNA report. The fearful, cowardly part of me that had been conditioned to play nice really wanted to shove it all back into the safe, pretend I knew nothing, and go back to being the quiet, invisible son. That version of me had survived 32 years on ignorance. She was very good at it. But my grandfather's voice kept echoing in my head. The truth is heavy, but it keeps your feet on the ground. So I kept pulling the thread. I called Aunt Vivian back, this time with a much sharper question. I asked her point blank if she remembered the name of the place in Texas. The silence on the line lasted so long I thought she had hung up on me. "You figured it out, didn't you?" she finally said. "You're not asking, Elias. You're confirming." I told her yes, I told her about the genomic analysis, just the broad strokes, leaving out the final results. And my aunt, who for 30 years had offered me nothing but cheap, low-stakes kindness, finally paid a real price for the truth. There was a highly exclusive private adoption agency and law firm in Dallas, she said. They handled ultra-discreet, closed adoptions for wealthy families. Margaret and William flew down there in March and came back in June with a baby and a script. Your grandfather, Harrison, he signed some financial guarantees to help them. I think a massive amount of offshore money changed hands. He made them swear that they would tell the boy the truth one day. But they never did. She took a sharp breath. For years, Harrison would corner Margaret every Christmas. When are you going to tell Preston? Harrison would ask. And your mother always gave the exact same answer. There is nothing to tell him. Then your grandfather would look over at you, Elias, sitting all by yourself at the very end of that long table, and the look on his face was heartbreaking. I asked her why nobody had ever told me a single word. Why I spent my entire childhood drowning in self-doubt, thinking I was the defective one. Because you were the living proof, honey, Aunt Vivian's voice cracked. 3 years after they made that pact and told the world William was cured and Margaret could never get pregnant again, you showed up. You were a total medical fluke. You were the living, breathing evidence that their perfect story was a complete lie. Every single time your mother or your father looked at you, they saw the scandal they tried to bury forever. It was never about you, Elias. You were just the only accident in that mansion that couldn't be erased or explained away. When I hung up the phone, I collapsed right onto the floor of my apartment. It wasn't because the information was brand new, I had already figured out most of it through logic, but hearing another living person say it out loud gave it a cold reality that papers can never convey. A document can tell you a fact, but a relative's shaking voice tells you exactly how cruel people had to be to keep you in the dark. I had to be incredibly careful because I've seen plenty of wealthy families destroy themselves over half-truths. So, before I fully committed to this, I did one more thing. I used every resource I had as a forensic accountant to track down the money. This was the exact moment when my job title stopped being a pathetic joke and became my sharpest weapon. I know how to dig up old archives. I know what's public, what's sealed, and how to get key information legally. Out of respect for my grandfather, Thomas Vance authorized me to look at Harrison Thorne's private bank trust records from the late 1980s. Buried in those dusty microfilms and yellowed bank statements, I found the record from the spring of 1988. There was a massive wire transfer from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands controlled by Harrison, sent directly to a trust account for a family law firm in Dallas that specialized in private adoptions. The amount was huge, enough to buy a desperate girl's lifetime silence and forge a seamless birth certificate. I also found an old envelope in grandfather's personal files. It was a handwritten letter from Margaret to grandfather, sent from Texas in 1988. I stood by the table in Thomas's conference room reading it, and halfway through I had to pull out a chair and sit down. The letter was written in code. It never explicitly used the word adoption, but it said, "The attorneys in Dallas want the final balance cleared before the court date. William and I have decided he never needs to know the truth. So please, Dad, this money has to stay strictly between us. If this gets out, it ruins William's reputation on the board, and it ruins this child's life. He never needs to know." The he was Preston. My grandfather kept that letter for 34 years. He knew all along, watching everything play out. That was what he meant when he said he couldn't tear the family apart based on a feeling. He was trapped by a promise and a desire to protect his own. He carried that weight by himself until he knew his time was running out. And then he went out and got the ironclad DNA proof. Because a letter isn't enough to alter the core terms of a family trust, but a legally binding genetic report is. Sitting in that conference room with 34 years of dirty secrets in my hands, I saw the whole picture perfectly clear. Preston was adopted through a secret private pipeline down south. My mother pulled a vanishing act for a single season and reinvented herself as a proud mother. And my parents made a brutal choice that I still can't fully comprehend. They buried the secret so deep that they raised Preston as the golden firstborn, while treating me, their actual, biological flesh and blood, like an annoying afterthought. I have to admit, for about a day I absolutely hated Preston. It's ugly, but it's the truth. For all those years he effortlessly enjoyed the kind of suffocating, unconditional love that I practically starved for, and he didn't have a single drop of Thorne blood in his veins. But I stopped myself almost immediately, because I ran the numbers with the coldest logic possible. Beneath all that resentment lay a truth that was much kinder, but also far more terrifying. Preston didn't know either. If my mother wrote, "He never needs to know," it meant Preston had spent his entire life playing the part of the golden boy, completely unaware that his identity was just a script written to cover a secret. He wasn't my enemy. He was just another casualty of the exact same lie. We were two brothers who grew up trapped in the exact same massive lie. One of us was wrapped up in love like a sparkling gift and hidden away from the world, while the other was ruthlessly pushed aside because I was the living, breathing proof that my father's precious ego hadn't completely failed him. I was the proof that their past panic was just a ridiculous farce. The night I finally connected all the dots, I completely broke down. For my entire life, I believed I wasn't loved because there was something fundamentally wrong with me, but I finally understood that when my mother looked at me, all she saw was the thorn in the side of her perfect life. Every time she looked at her actual biological son, she was looking at the truth she had spent 30 years pretending didn't exist. So she pushed the evidence all the way to the far end of the dining table. That night, I collapsed on my apartment floor, leaning against the kitchen cabinets, and cried like a child. It was that ugly, breathless kind of sobbing. My dog, Bullet, was pacing around me anxiously, licking the tears off my face. Eventually, I washed my face, poured myself a heavy glass of bourbon, and pulled out a yellow legal pad. Because if there's one thing I learned a long time ago, it's that the only way I know how to survive a crisis is to organize it with logic. If you've listened this far, you probably already know that I wasn't about to pull some cheap, petty stunt just to feel good in the moment. I could have easily crashed a family dinner and slammed that DNA report onto the table. But before I tell you what I actually did, I want you to do something for me. Pause for just a second and try to guess how you think this story ends. Do you think my mother broke down in tears begging for forgiveness? Do you think Preston and I ended up bitter enemies tearing each other apart in a courtroom? Keep that guess in mind. Write it down if you want to. Because what actually happened next around that table wasn't my original plan, and it completely caught everyone off guard. I promise you, this ending lands in a place you will never see coming. Now let me show you how I set the board. I want to make one thing clear. I wasn't building a weapon to destroy anyone. I was building a solid floor for myself, a place to stand when the ground beneath my feet inevitably shattered. Because I knew the second I spoke up, the entire world was going to shake. Over the next 2 weeks, my mother started dropping these passive-aggressive bombs into the family group text, a chat where I barely ever said a word. It was all about the upcoming will reading and how they needed to clean up Harrison's loose ends before Preston left for his European vacation the following month. Meanwhile, I was quietly putting together an ironclad chain of evidence. I went to a notary and made 3 certified copies of the genomic report, locking the originals safely in Thomas Vance's office vault. I scanned the 1988 letter my grandfather had saved, along with the offshore wire transfer receipts sent to Dallas. I mapped out the legal chain of custody for the DNA, the court-admissible lab credentials, and the bulletproof validity of the updated will. I built a clean, precise timeline with dates and sources, treating it with the exact same rigor I'd use if I were handing a fraud case over to the FBI. I didn't do this because I was cold-blooded. I did it because I knew my mother. The absolute first thing she would do when the truth came out would be to accuse me of forging the papers. While I was building my fortress, I watched them happily setting their own trap. Turns out, my mother had been busy too. Reading between the lines of the family chat and listening to the casual things Preston let slip, I pieced together the script my parents had written for this big family meeting. They were totally convinced that the Adirondack cabin and the trust fund were rightfully theirs to hand over to Preston. My mother even accidentally mentioned in the chat that they had already cleared things with a few older relatives, treating the will reading like a hollow legal formality. My father had apparently already promised Preston and his wife that they could start remodeling the log cabin this summer. They had absolutely no idea the will had been changed. They had no idea what was waiting inside that manila envelope. They were swaggering right up to a door they thought they owned the keys to, completely blind to the monster they'd hidden behind it for 34 years. During those 2 weeks, my mother did something incredibly cruel, and she didn't even realize it. She called me. She actually reached out to me out of the blue, which almost never happens. Using a warm, nurturing tone I hadn't heard in decades, she asked me to keep the peace at the meeting. I know things have always been a little strained between us, Elias, she said, but the family's image comes first. Preston's been under so much stress lately with a corporate merger at work. Let's just keep this simple. Let's make sure Harrison's wishes are respected. Let's make sure Harrison's wishes are respected. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. I told her, "That's exactly what I want, Mom. I am going to make sure Grandpa's real wishes are respected 100%. She heard compliance. What I actually said was a judgment she couldn't even fathom in her wildest dreams. There was one moment during those 2 weeks that I still think about all the time. Aunt Vivian called me completely out of nowhere. She told me she couldn't stop thinking about the questions I'd been asking. There was a long silence on the line, and then she said, "Elias, honey, whatever it is you've uncovered, just be careful. Your mother has spent her entire life protecting that perfect script. People like her don't get sad when the script gets torn apart. They get incredibly dangerous." She paused again. "But no matter what, you were always the one who actually deserved that cabin. Harrison always knew that." So Aunt Vivian knew at least part of the truth. I asked her softly if she was going to be at the family meeting. She said she would. I told her I might need a witness, someone who would tell the truth no matter whose feathers got ruffled. The phone line went completely dead silent for what felt like an eternity. "I've kept that vain woman's secrets for 30 years, she finally said. "I think I'm done." The weekend before the meeting, I drove up to the Adirondacks alone. I told myself I was going to inspect the property since it was about to be legally mine. That was just a lie, I told myself. The real reason was that before I walked into a battlefield where I had never been welcome, I needed to stand in the one place on earth where I had actually been loved. Thomas gave me the keys. The cabin was cold and dead quiet, with dust sheets thrown over all the furniture, but the air still carried that exact same smell of pine needles and old leather. It was the scent of 30 years of safety. I walked slowly through every single room. The deck where he taught me chess. The bar counter where he helped stop the bleeding when I cut my lip, secretly saving the DNA. The wooden dock he built with his own hands, the edges now graying and weathered. Out on the deck, I noticed the chess table was still sitting there. In the drawer underneath, I found his old chess set, the edges of the pieces worn smooth by time. Tucked inside the box was an old photo. I almost didn't have the courage to look at it, but I'm so glad I did. It was a picture of me, maybe 11 years old, standing on the dock, laughing hysterically because I'd caught a massive fish. Written on the back in his strong, steady handwriting were just a few words. "Elias, the one who sees the whole board, the one who stays. Not the kid in his own world, not independent, not the one we don't have to worry about. The one who sees the whole board, the one who stays." I sat on the edge of that dock and finally let myself completely fall apart. I cried without holding anything back, with nobody around to force me to be composed. I cried for the little boy in that photo who spent the next 20 years believing he was completely worthless. I cried for my grandfather, who saw the whole truth but was held hostage for 30 years by his own family's selfishness. I even squeezed out a tear for my mother, because spending your entire life guarding a rotting door and pushing away your own flesh and blood just to keep it shut must be its own exhausting kind of hell. When I was done, I washed my face with the freezing lake water and drove back to Chicago. Somewhere along the highway, all the fear left me, and it never came back. I wasn't walking into that meeting to win an argument. I was walking in to drop a 34-year-old weight right onto the floor where it belonged. My grandfather had carried it long enough. It was my turn now, and once I dropped it, it wasn't going to hurt anyone else. I had my floor. I had my witness. I had the DNA report, the wire transfers, the will, and the bloody truth. Now I only had one choice left to make, and it was the hardest one. How to do this without turning into the kind of cruel person my grandfather wouldn't recognize? Because that was the question I kept asking myself on my kitchen floor, down that long highway, and in the gray, sleepless hours of the morning. I could completely destroy my mother. The explosives were all wired. I could stand up at that grand conference table and blow her life to pieces right in front of the audience she loved to perform for. And God, the 10-year-old boy inside me holding that math medal, wanted to see it so badly his teeth ached. But grandfather's note said I was the only one who is never cruel. He handed me a lethal weapon while praising my mercy. I took that as a challenge. Could I hold the ultimate truth without becoming the monster my mother was? I decided to tell the truth, all of it, exactly as it happened. I wasn't going to soften the facts to protect people who had never protected me. But I was absolutely not going to target Preston because he was innocent. I was going to aim the lens exactly where it belonged, at the two people who engineered and profited off a 34-year lie. The meeting was set for a Saturday in June, up in the luxury executive boardroom at the top of the Thorne Group headquarters. Thomas Vance was there to read the will. My mother had turned it into a grand coronation. She set out a catering spread from a top-tier restaurant, used the finest bone china, and invited almost every relative in the inner circle. She desperately wanted an audience to witness her precious golden boy take his throne. And what she was about to get was an audience for a completely different kind of show. That morning, I drove downtown with that thick folder sitting in the passenger seat, and my grandfather's note tucked safely in my pocket. It was honestly the calmest day I'd had in years. For the first time in my entire life, I knew exactly where I stood. I was standing on the side of the truth. It just took me 32 years and an old man's death to finally get here. I made a point to show up early. I wanted 10 minutes alone with my mother before the room filled up. No matter how bad the storm got, I didn't want her to be able to accuse me of blindsiding her in public without giving her a chance to bow out with a shred of dignity. She was in the small staging kitchen right next to the boardroom. She was wearing a deep navy blue designer suit, her go-to uniform for important events, and was busy directing the servers on where to place the upscale French hors d'oeuvres. She looked up and flashed me that trademark professional smile. "Elias, you're early. Don't just stand there like a statue. Go make sure the place cards are set up right." I didn't touch the place cards. I just said, "Mom, I need to talk to you alone for a minute before everyone else gets here." Something cold in my voice made her put down the serving tongs. She crossed her arms. "If this is you complaining about the seating chart again, I don't have time to redo." "It's about Preston," I said, "and the log cabin, and what Grandpa actually uncovered before he died." In that exact second, and I swear to you, I will remember this second for the rest of my life, a tiny flicker went off deep in my mother's eyes. It wasn't confusion. It was resignation. It was the exact look of a person who had spent 30 years hiding behind a door, finally hearing someone knock. But she recovered fast. She always did. "I have no idea what kind of ridiculous nonsense you think you've stumbled on," she said, her voice dropping to a chill. "But today is about honoring your grandfather. Don't do what you always do and try to make yourself the center of attention." The old instinct almost kicked in. That knee-jerk reaction from a lifetime of being pushed down, that urge to just lower my head and back off. But I didn't. I pulled that manila envelope out of my folder. I didn't show her the report itself, just the envelope with the lab's anti-counterfeit security seal and return address. I laid it gently on the marble countertop between us, right next to her perfectly arranged appetizers. "Grandpa hired them last September," I said quietly. "He kept the cigar Preston smoked and the glass with my blood on it. You know exactly what kind of lab this is. As your son, I'm only going to ask you this one time. Do you want to tell everyone yourself or do you want me to do it?" I watched the color completely drain from my mother's face. She stared at that envelope like it was a live animal that might bite her, her lips parted, closing and opening again. Then, because she just couldn't help being who she was, she chose the absolute dumbest, most vicious defense possible. She dropped her voice to a poisonous hiss. "You ungrateful little brat. We gave you a privileged life. We gave both of you everything. You're not going to swagger in here on my turf with some fake trash you bought off the internet and use your pathetic jealousy to ruin your brother's life." Perfect. She knew exactly what was inside. There was no other explanation. I had offered her an exit, and she welded the door shut right in my face. "I didn't buy this on the internet," I said. "Thomas Vance handled it. And this isn't jealousy. This is what Grandpa left for me." The automatic doors out front chimed. The first guests had arrived. In the span of a single breath, my mother smoothed out the wrinkles in her suit, flipped her expression right back to a flawless social smile, and brushed past me to welcome them. But as she walked by, she muttered under her breath, "You don't have the guts, Elias." For 32 years, I was the spineless son who didn't have the guts. All her security was built on that one assumption. The boardroom filled up quickly. Aunt Vivian caught my eye from across the long table and gave me a subtle nod. Preston walked in with his wife, practically glowing with the confidence of a successful man. He came over, gave me a hug, and patted my shoulder. "Glad you could make it, man. You've been a ghost lately." I hugged him back, feeling the incredibly fragile floor of lies we were both standing on. My father was working the room, shaking hands, looking on top of the world. Thomas Vance sat quietly at the far end of the conference table, his worn leather briefcase sitting in front of him. He was a lone soldier keeping a dying man's final promise. After a light lunch, the main event started. My mother took control of the room again, sharing a few funny stories about grandfather, though without fail, she made sure she was the hero of every single one. While everyone was sipping coffee, my father tapped his glass and cleared his throat, announcing it was time to discuss handing over the trust. He turned to Thomas with that arrogant confidence of a successful man who has never been told no in his life. Thomas, since the family's all here, I think we all know how Harrison wanted to pass down the legacy. Whenever you're ready, go ahead. Thomas clicked open his briefcase. He looked over at me, his eyes held one last question. I gave him a firm, solid nod. Actually, William, Thomas said, his voice slow and steady. Harrison's instructions were incredibly specific, and I'm afraid they differ quite a bit from what you were expecting. He updated his will last October. His mind was certified as completely sound. I had a formal psychiatric evaluation done, and the medical documents are all right here. He laid several stamped official documents flat on the table. The Adirondack log cabin, along with all interests in the Thorne family holding trust, Thomas paused, will go to his proven, direct biological descendants. Furthermore, he attached a mandatory identity verification requirement as a prerequisite. The room went dead silent. The smile didn't leave my mother's face, but her fingernails dug hard into the edge of the marble table. Verification of biological descendants? What does that even mean? My father frowned. What kind of prerequisite is that? Aren't Preston and Elias both his biological grandsons? That's exactly the point, Thomas said mildly. Harrison required official biological proof, and he left that verification document in Elias's possession. In a flash, every single eye in that room locked onto me. I finally realized that my entire 30 years of walking on eggshells had just been a quiet preparation to get me to this exact moment. I could feel the 10-year-old boy with the math medal, the 19-year-old packing his bags for college alone, and the grown man collapsing on the kitchen floor. They were all standing right there behind me. I held on to my grandfather's words in my head, the only one among them who is never cruel. I pulled out the report. My hands were completely steady. Grandpa loved this family, I said, looking around the room, keeping my voice level. But he also knew that the foundation of this family was built on top of a secret that nobody was brave enough to say out loud. Before he passed away, he privately hired a top-tier forensic genetic laboratory. He provided his own sample, and at the same time, he got samples from both of us. As I said the next words, I looked right into Preston's eyes. Because he had the right to hear this from someone who wasn't going to use it as a weapon to hurt him. Preston, what I'm about to say is absolutely not a shot at you, I said softly. None of this is your fault, not even a little bit. You are completely innocent in this, and you had no idea. Preston just stared at me totally blank. What? I had no idea about what? Until 2 weeks ago I was completely in the dark just like you. Elias! My mother's voice cracked like a whip across the room. Shut your mouth right now! I didn't shut my mouth. This court-admissible report confirms 2 things, I continued. First, I am Harrison's biological grandson. The Y chromosome and ancestral markers are a 99.9% match. I slid the page with the gray summary box right down the center of the long table, face up. Second, I said, and for the first time my throat felt a little tight, but I let the emotion show because grandfather told me that bottling it up just turns your heart to stone. Second, Preston is not a blood match to Harrison, nor is he William's son or Margaret's. The genetic markers completely exclude him from the Thorne lineage. Silence. The silence that followed felt heavy, like it had actual physical weight. It was the deafening sound of a 34-year-old shell of lies shattering into pieces. My mother slammed her hands on the table and stood up. This is absolute garbage, she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. This is a complete forgery. Elias has been bitterly jealous since he was a little boy. He's always tried to find ways to tear this perfect family apart. He actually went out and fabricated this disgusting fake document just to humiliate us. The script was playing out exactly the way it always does. When a lie tries to use pure arrogance to outrun the truth, it's bound to trip and fall flat on its face. Because Thomas Vance cleared his throat and said in an almost casual, relaxed tone, "Margaret, I personally commissioned that lab on Harrison's behalf. The chain of custody paperwork is fully intact. That laboratory holds the highest level of court accreditation. I'd be very careful using the word forgery. That crosses into defamation." My mother snatched the piece of paper off the table. She honestly thought she could just rip it up. But I had brought 3 certified copies, and the original was locked in Thomas's safe. A forensic accountant who spends his days watching wealthy families sue each other over ledgers is never going to walk into a fight with his only copy. Her eyes raced wildly across the paper, scanning back and forth, stopping, starting, and stopping again. I watched her quietly, letting her burn through her very last shred of a cover right in front of everyone. "This doesn't prove anything," she stammered, her voice now as thin as a piece of tissue paper. "These DNA tests make mistakes all the time. The news is full of mix-ups like this." "Then how do you explain the money in this letter?" I said, pulling out the rest of the documents. This was my second card. I had printed them out extra large beforehand, making sure everyone in the room could see them clearly. I held them up high. "This is a wire transfer receipt for $500,000 from Grandpa's account in the Cayman Islands. The recipient is a private law firm in Dallas, Texas, that specializes in closed adoptions. The date is the spring of 1988. And then there's this, in your own handwriting, 34 years ago. The attorneys in Dallas want the final balance cleared before the court date. William and I have decided he never needs to know the truth." "This is a letter you wrote to Grandpa from Texas, Mom," I stated calmly. "Grandpa kept it for 34 years. Do you want me to read the whole letter out loud to everyone, or do you want to explain what it means yourself?" Sitting at the far end of the table, a younger cousin of ours who was still in college, a kid named Tyler, broke the suffocating silence, blurting out, "Aunt Margaret, is that actually true?" My mother, the woman who had spent her entire life meticulously controlling every single social event, the woman who absolutely refused to allow a single flaw, just stared at a 20-something kid. For the first time ever, she couldn't squeeze out a single drop of acting to deal with him. She turned and glared at Thomas, and then fixed her eyes directly on me. That calm disguise of hers, which I had spent my entire life viewing as an unbreakable wall of ice, completely and utterly shattered. "You have absolutely no idea what you've done," she screamed at me, her entire body shaking. "You don't understand the price we paid back then to give that boy a normal life." "Whose life were you protecting, Margaret?" Aunt Vivian's cold voice cut in from the far end of the table. She stood up too. "Say it out loud, sister. You've hidden it for 34 years. If you don't say it out loud in front of everyone today, I'll say it for you." Preston's face was as white as a sheet. His eyes darted desperately back and forth between our mother, Aunt Vivian, and the documents on the table. When he finally found his voice, he sounded as small as a lost child. "Mom, what is she talking about? What does she mean, giving me a normal life?" My mother opened her mouth, but absolutely nothing came out. And right there in that dead silence, my father, the man who for the last 30-odd years had only cared about refilling his own drink, the man who hadn't stood up to shield me from a single scolding, suddenly buried his face deep in his hands. He let out a muffled, broken sob. "We adopted you, Preston," he choked out through his fingers, his voice completely splintered. "In Dallas, back in 1988, I found out I was severely infertile. To save face, we did the paperwork behind everyone's back. We swore we'd never tell a soul, not even you." What happened next is a scene I've replayed in my head 1,000 times. Preston didn't scream. He didn't flip the table, at least not at first. He just stared at the 2 parents who had raised him with this incredibly strange, horrified look in his eyes. Then he slowly turned his head and looked at me. In that exact moment, he said something that made me completely certain that underneath all that gold-plated vanity, he was still a good person who had been trapped by an awful lie. "Then why the hell did you do it?" he yelled at our so-called parents, raising his voice for the first time all day. "What gave you the right to spend a lifetime telling Elias he didn't deserve to be in this family? He's the only one among us who he's your real flesh and blood." Preston couldn't even finish the sentence. He turned around to face me, the younger brother he had looked down on for 30 years, his eyes completely bloodshot. "Elias, I am so incredibly sorry. I swear to God, I had absolutely no idea." In that exact second, that long conference table stopped belonging to William and Margaret. It finally belonged to us. My mother still tried to make one last desperate move to snatch back control of the narrative. She had been the driver her entire life. "Everyone just calm down," she shouted, raising her voice over the room. "These test results, these stupid papers make mistakes all the time. We can go to our own doctor and redo the tests. We can... I cut her off. "I agree. Go redo the tests. I'll pay for it. You can pick any top-tier forensic lab in the country. I'm not afraid of the answer." "But you are, Mom. You're scared to death. You've been terrified for 34 years. And that is the exact reason I had to spend my whole life sitting at the very end of the dinner table." She had absolutely nothing left to say because there was no way to argue. The entire room had witnessed it. All those well-dressed relatives, my completely broken father, and Aunt Vivian watching coldly like a courtroom witness. My mother didn't have a single mask left to wear. The ridiculous show called The Perfect Family was officially over. All that was left on the stage was the naked truth. It had actually been sitting there all along, just waiting for someone brave enough, or a dying old man, to walk over and flip the light switch. Thomas brought everyone back to reality using his usual quiet, professional lawyer voice. "The terms of the will stand, effective immediately," he said. "The Adirondack log cabin and the Thorn Trust go to Harrison's proven biological descendant. That person is Elias." He looked at me, and on his weathered old face I could faintly see a shadow of my grandfather smiling back. "Harrison also left a letter for you, meant to be read after this whole circus was over. He figured you might really need it right about now." That luxury-catered lunch ended up completely falling apart. Nobody stayed for dessert, nobody poured another cup of coffee, and there were absolutely no polite goodbyes. Those expensive French appetizers just sat there getting cold on the silver platters. My mother stood completely alone at the head of the long table, with nobody left willing to play the part of her guest. The relatives made quick excuses and rushed out the door. Someone blamed the long drive, someone else suddenly remembered an important business meeting. When a super-private, wealthy family exposes its incredibly ugly inner workings, people's instinct is to grab their coats and run. My father never lifted his head from his hands. My mother just stood there like a skipping record, repeating the same hollow phrases over and over to a completely empty room. "It's not what you think. We were forced into it. How could you all betray me?" That college cousin of ours, Tyler, gave me a tight hug on his way out the door and whispered in my ear, "For what it's worth, man, I always thought you were the coolest one in this family anyway." That made me smile for the first time in 2 weeks. Aunt Vivian stayed until the very end. She was in the staging kitchen, helping clean up the fancy porcelain plates that my mother couldn't care less about anymore. Before she left, she cupped my face in her hands and used her thumb to wipe away a tear I hadn't even realized was there. "Harrison would be so incredibly proud of you," she said. "He's definitely smiling down on you from somewhere right now." I chose to believe her. Preston and his wife left pretty early on. He wasn't mad at me. He was furious at the 2 liars who had raised him. Before he even hit the highway, he sent me a text from his car. "My head is a complete mess right now, and I can't think straight. But the one thing I know for sure is that you're my brother, and I've been blind for half my life. Can we grab a drink somewhere this week?" I texted back absolutely before he could even see the read receipt. I was the last one to leave the boardroom. I packed up my folder, the copies, and the printed photos, but none of the originals were in there. I had kept the real leverage locked away in the safest place possible all along. It seemed like it was only in that final moment that my mother realized it. The son she had always dismissed as a quiet misfit who wouldn't amount to anything had quietly backed her into a corner where she didn't have a single move left. As I reached the double mahogany doors of the boardroom, she called my name. Just a cold, sharp, "Elias." I stopped. I turned around and waited. I gave her one last chance to apologize, just like I had in the kitchen that morning. But she still couldn't do it. "You destroyed this family," she said, choosing those words as her final goodbye. I just stared at her for a long time. This was the woman whose approval I had spent 34 years begging for. And at that exact moment, that useless chase finally came to an end. It wasn't because she finally gave me what I wanted, but because I realized I didn't want a single thing from her anymore. "No, Mom," I answered calmly. "You hid a child for 34 years to save face, and then to protect that lie, you turned your own biological son into a ghost. I just walked into the room and turned on the lights. Whatever act you guys choose to play under those lights from now on is completely up to you." With that, I pushed the door open and walked away. I'd love to tell you that winning felt like that incredible rush of satisfaction you see in revenge movies, but it didn't. Watching my mother's perfect disguise shatter into pieces didn't give the angry 10-year-old boy inside me the kind of payback he used to fantasize about. It just felt sad. She was a pathetic woman who had wasted her entire life guarding a vain lie, and in the end, it cost her the only son who actually shared her blood. If you've been waiting for years for an apology that is never going to come, if you have someone in your life who refuses to say "I'm sorry" even when the truth is staring them right in the face, I hope you take to heart what I realized that day around that long table. It took me 34 years to learn this, and I'm giving it to you for free. You will never find your healing in their confession. That apology is never coming. Your closure has to come from somewhere else. And let me tell you exactly where I found mine. That log cabin ended up being worth an absolute fortune. But it had nothing to do with the money. In the weeks after that meeting, the Thorne family went through a massive earthquake, shifting and realigning along completely new fault lines. Some people stood on my side of the crack and some stayed on theirs. My parents actually went and got their own DNA test done. I knew they would, and I knew exactly what it would say. The results came back identical to the report Harrison had ordered. They never told me about it themselves. I heard it from Aunt Vivian. They just naturally drifted into a total silence, using the exact same cold shoulder on each other that they used to punish me with for 30 years. Only this time, they were the ones suffocating in it. My mother still hasn't apologized. Honestly, I don't think she knows how. The script she built her life on was a load-bearing wall. You pull it down, and the whole house collapses. I guess she's still standing tall in the middle of those ruins, pretending it's a palace. My father only called me once, late at night. He managed to say, "Elias, before his voice cracked so hard he couldn't keep going. We just stayed on the line, holding our phones in complete silence for a solid minute. "I know, Dad," I said quietly, and then I hung up. That was the last time we spoke. Preston and I have had a drink together every single week since then. It was awkward at first, incredibly awkward. We had to learn how to be brothers without the scripts we'd been handed as kids. He ended up refusing to take a single dime of my parents' money, and he stepped down from his position at the family firm. He told me he wanted to find out who he actually was when he wasn't playing the role of the golden heir. He's running a small logistics company now, and honestly, he looks happier and lighter than I've ever seen him. I kept the log cabin exactly the way Grandfather left it. I didn't change a single piece of furniture, and I didn't repaint a single wall. I go up there about 2 weekends a month with Bullet. On my very first night staying there alone, I sat out on the wooden dock, listening to the lake water lap against the posts, and finally opened the letter Thomas Vance handed me. It was inside a small envelope, written on that same thick notepad paper. "Elias," it read, "if you are reading this, it means the board has been cleared and the pieces are back in the box. I am sorry I had to leave you to play the final move alone, but I had to ensure you had the proper pieces to win. The cabin is yours. The legacy is yours. But more importantly, your life is finally yours. You no longer have to sit at the edge of anyone else's table because you have built your own. Live well, my boy. You are a thorn, not because of a name, but because you survived the wilderness." I folded the note, slipped it into my pocket, and looked out over the dark water. The boy who thought he was a mistake was gone. The man who saw the whole board was finally home. Finally, he just said, "Good night, my son." In my memory, that was the closest he'd ever come to acting like a real father to me. I decided to let that phone call be the last piece of dignity between us. I stopped asking for anything more. The absolute greatest surprise of my life was Preston. About 2 weeks later, when we were both completely exhausted from the fallout, we met up for a whiskey at a bar downtown. He confessed to me that he'd never once questioned why our mother had such an obvious, blatant favoritism toward him. He had just naively assumed, exactly like our parents had spent years drilling into his head, that it was because I was naturally distant and difficult to be around. He actually cried right in front of me for holding on to that kind of conditioned prejudice. And then he said something that I still play back in my head all the time. "Elias," he said, "we were both just tools to them. They used you to cover up where I came from, and they used me to keep up their perfect lie. Neither one of us ever got a fair shot at just being a normal kid." He wasn't my enemy. He never had been. We were just two guys who had survived the exact same vicious lie from opposite ends of the scale. And slowly, carefully, we're learning how to be the real brothers our parents never allowed us to be. He didn't ask for a single dime or a square inch of that property. He told me it was the best decision Harrison ever made. I told him the door to the cabin is always open and he can come up whenever he wants to get away. I meant it too, because a massive log cabin with only one person inside isn't a legacy. It's just a sad tomb with a nice dock. On my very first weekend officially taking over the property, I sat by myself out on the wooden dock stretching over the lake, and I finally opened the last letter Grandfather left for me. I want to share how the letter ends with you, because what actually healed my 30 years of old scars wasn't the legal will. It was this note. "My Elias," he wrote, "I am so incredibly sorry it took me a lifetime to put the proof I always suspected into your hands. You were never the misfit who didn't belong in that house. You belonged so completely, so purely, that your mother couldn't even look you in the eye. Don't waste another single year of your life trying to please people who graded you on a rigged exam. You always got a low score because they designed it for you to fail from day one. But son, the day you were born, you passed my test with flying colors. That house is yours now, that lake, and the dock your grandfather built with his own hands. It's all yours. Every summer that I can't be there with you, fill those empty rooms with people who actually lift you up into the light. Love always and forever, Harrison." I sat on that dock that day until the sun completely sank beneath the water. I didn't cry all that much. The wound that had defined the first half of my life, the one that made me sure I was unlovable and carried some deep soul defect my own mother could sense, it didn't magically vanish overnight. 30 years of damage doesn't heal in a second. But just like he promised, I finally felt the solid ground beneath my feet. I was never a defective person who didn't deserve love. I was just an inconvenient truth standing in the way of someone else's lie. There is a world of difference between those two things, and I had spent 32 years standing on the completely wrong side of it. So, this is the thought I want to leave you with, because I know some of you out there need to hear this a lot more than you need to hear the rest of my messy family drama. The people who make you feel like you aren't enough, the ones who make you feel like an outsider, are almost always desperately trying to cover up their own internal rot. They aren't actually pointing out a flaw in you. That massive personality defect you've spent years looking for, the one you might have spent a fortune on therapy trying to fix, it doesn't exist. It never did. You just accidentally stepped into the spotlight of a lie someone was using to cover themselves, and they simply didn't have the courage to look at the truth shining off of you. You don't need them to say it out loud. My parents will probably go to their graves never admitting it. You just need to find one person, whether they're still here or long gone, who can look at you clearly and lift you into the light. And if you can't find that person right now, then you need to be that person for yourself. And be that person for the next kid who gets forced to sit at the far end of the table. That Adirondack log cabin is mine now. I'm going to sit out on that deck and play chess with whoever I damn well choose. And the head of that long dining table belongs to me now too. Not because I won some petty argument, but because the only person in this world who ever truly saw me used his very last breath to make sure I'd never have to sit by the kitchen doors like a guest ever again. I always belonged here, and so do you. Go find your doc. My name is Clara Vance. I'm 32 years old. Exactly 6 hours after I was rushed into an emergency C-section, my father marched into my high-security recovery room with a lawyer in a sharp suit and coldly told me, "Your mental state and your finances prove you are completely unfit to be a mother. A broken woman like you has no business raising a Harrington heir. We are taking our grandson so you don't ruin him too, and you are not getting your hands on a single cent of his family trust." I just lay there in that hospital bed, the surgical staples in my abdomen still oozing blood, the epidural completely wearing off, leaving my legs feeling like dead weight. I was entirely alone. My husband, Marcus, was on the top floor of this exact building, running the final negotiations for a multi-billion-dollar healthcare merger. His phone was locked down on a secure, silent protocol, and my mother just stood quietly behind my father, clutching a designer baby bag she had packed months ago. They had it all ready. Months of forged psychiatric evaluations, fake debt spreadsheets, and emergency custody papers. They thought they caught me at my absolute weakest. They thought they had won. But what they didn't know was that this elite private hospital in the heart of Boston was owned entirely by the medical conglomerate my husband was representing. The head nurse hit the enter key on her keyboard, and just 90 seconds later, their perfect little plan started blowing up in their faces in the most devastating way possible. If you've ever been labeled as broken, unstable, or unfit by the people who were supposed to love you the most, especially when you were at your most vulnerable, do me a favor and type "enough" in the comments right now. Let me know that I'm not the only one who has had to fight this battle. Now let me take you back to the exact second I drifted out of that morphine fog, the moment I saw exactly what my own parents were trying to do to me. The digital clock on the wall read 4:04 p.m. My son, Leo, had been born at 10:04 a.m., 6 hours on the dot. It had been 6 hours since they cut open my stomach to pull him out. I only got to hold him for maybe 30 seconds before the nurses rushed him off to the NICU. Just standard monitoring, they told me. Standard C-section protocol. I kept trying to replay those 30 seconds in my mind. His weight, his first cry, and the way his tiny fist tightly gripped my finger right before they took him away. The morphine made everything feel soft and blurry. The plastic medical ID band was snug against my wrist, my name printed in bold black letters, Clara Vance. Right below it was a barcode that perfectly matched the one wrapped around Leo's ankle. Even though we were in separate rooms, we were locked together. "Where is Leo?" I asked, my voice sounding incredibly raspy. "Is he okay?" The nurse checking my vitals had incredibly kind eyes. She smiled and said, "He's doing great, sweetie, just across the hall in the nursery. You'll see him soon. For now, you need to rest." But I couldn't rest. There was this heavy feeling hanging in the room. It wasn't a physical pain, it was something else. Where was Marcus? Why wasn't he here? I checked the clock again. 4:06 p.m. He had walked into the executive boardroom on the top floor at 11:15 a.m. It was a closed-door negotiation for a massive hospital acquisition. They expected it to take 5 hours, meaning it could wrap up any second or it could drag on forever. That's just how those high-stakes corporate deals go. The premium leather visitor's chair next to my bed was completely empty. He was supposed to be sitting there. If he could have slipped away, he would have been there in a heartbeat. My phone was locked in a locker downstairs, and the red nurse call button was resting right under my right palm, warm from my hand. Should I press it? What would I even say? That I had a bad feeling? That my chest felt tight for reasons that had nothing to do with surgery? The PCA pump hummed quietly next to me. I could press the button for another dose of pain meds, but I'd already hit my limit for the hour. The little green light just blinked at me. I tried to wiggle my toes, but I barely felt anything. The spinal block was wearing off, leaving that pins and needles burning sensation that meant my feelings were coming back. My legs felt like lead weights, completely unmovable. Hospital rules after a C-section mean you aren't even allowed to try to stand up for at least 12 hours. 22 metal staples were holding my lower stomach together. Every single time I took a deep breath, I could feel them pulling at my skin. The blood pressure cuff on my arm automatically pumped up, 95/62. On the lower side, but steady. I was still bleeding, but the nurse assured me it was totally normal post-pregnancy bleeding that would last for weeks. The catheter bag hung off the side of the bed filled with amber fluid. The IV line in the back of my right hand kept me pinned down. I was completely trapped by wires and tubes, stuck in that bed in the most vulnerable position I had ever been in during my 32 years on Earth. I'm a forensic accountant. My day job is digging through messy financial statements and trust funds to catch white-collar criminals hiding behind numbers. But right then, I couldn't even get out of bed to protect my own son. And that's exactly when I heard the footsteps, 3 sets of shoes walking down the hallway. Before my brain could even process it, my heart rate monitor spiked, jumping from 72 to 89 in a matter of seconds. I knew that walk anywhere, precise, confident, and carrying the kind of heavy arrogance that demanded control over whatever room it entered. It was my father. The door handle turned. The chrome metal caught the cold March afternoon sun cutting through the Boston sky. The blinds were half drawn, throwing long shadows across the oak floors. That empty chair felt like a slap in the face. Marcus was supposed to be here. The door pushed open, and Arthur Harrington walked in first. The last time we had spoken face-to-face was at my wedding. He and my mother had refused to attend, telling me, "We do not accept a marriage that is so beneath our status." A self-made lawyer does not belong in the Harrington bloodline. When I emailed them to let them know I was pregnant, they sent back a single ice-cold sentence. Now here they were, and 3 years of dead silence erupted in a single second. My mother followed behind him like a shadow, her eyes glued to the floor, her knuckles turning bone white from clutching an Hermes baby bag she had clearly bought months ago. Bringing up the rear was a lawyer who looked incredibly expensive but entirely tense. He didn't smile, he didn't ask how I was feeling, and he didn't look at me like a mother who had just delivered a firstborn grandson. He looked at me like a bankruptcy case file waiting to be liquidated. "Clara," my father said, "we need to talk. My father, Arthur Harrington, is a control freak. If that's a talent, he has mastered it to a terrifying degree. He can turn any space, a courtroom, a boardroom, even a maternity ward, into his personal interrogation room." He pulled the visitor's chair close, way too close, stepping right over what psychology calls a person's safe personal space. He sat down and crossed his hands, a signature move I grew up watching. That gesture always meant, I've already made my decision, and this conversation is just a formality. My mother lingered by the door, holding tight to that white bag, completely refusing to look at me. The third man, who looked about 50, stood by the window in a custom dark charcoal suit, holding a leather briefcase with a heavy brass clasp. "This is Preston Croft," my father said. "He's a top-tier specialist in family wealth management and estate law. We hired him to handle a sensitive matter involving your son and the family trust." Croft gave a stiff nod, expressionless, and set his briefcase down on the windowsill. The brass clasp clicked open, sounding deafeningly loud in the small hospital room. "Mr. Harrington," I said, my voice coming out way steadier than I expected, "what is the meaning of this?" My father's face didn't move a muscle. He reached out to take a heavy manila folder from Croft. "Clara, honey," my mother finally whimpered, her voice shaking, "please just do what he says. This is for the best." The folder dropped heavily onto my nightstand, knocking against my water pitcher. The pitcher rocked, but luckily didn't spill. My father slid the file toward me. "Clara," he said, "as of this afternoon, we have officially filed an emergency petition for custody of your son in the Suffolk County Superior Court. Along with that, we're filing to freeze and take over the $50 million generation skipping trust fund established in his name." The words sounded completely foreign in my head. They hit my morphine-numbed brain like heavy stones, making zero sense. Custody? The trust? Today? The papers were officially stamped at 1:35 p.m. today. His voice was as cold and precise as a machine. "We are the petitioners. You are the respondent. Given your current physical state, the hidden financial crisis you're drowning in, and your documented history of mental instability, we feel we have to step in immediately to protect the child's safety and the family's assets." I just stared at him, then at the folder, and finally at my mother, who still couldn't look me in the eye. "What financial crisis? What mental instability?" I asked through my teeth. Croft cleared his throat. "Mrs. Vance, if you'd like to review the petition—" "Her legal name," my father cut him off brutally, "is Clara Harrington. That's how the court documents were filed. There is no Vance, only Harrington." Just like that, it was like Marcus didn't even exist. It was like my last 3 years of life, the dignity of carrying my husband's name, was completely erased by his pen. My hand shook as I reached for the folder. The brass fasteners scratched against my finger, and the bold official print on the cover stabbed at my eyes. "Suffolk County Superior Court Emergency Petition for Temporary Custody and Conservatorship, Case Number 2026-CV-8842. Petitioners, Arthur Harrington, Eleanor Harrington. Respondent, Clara Harrington. Attachments, 60 pages. My name was misspelled on page 3, pure carelessness. I flipped to page 4. November 12, 2025. That was a day I spent entirely in Manhattan on a business trip, running a grueling financial audit on a public company suspected of fraud until 10 at night. I had flight records, hotel receipts, and dozens of time-stamped work emails to prove it. Yet right there, attached to the file, was a 10-page medical and financial evaluation, claiming that on that exact day, I was sitting in a private clinic I had never heard of, crying about massive, illegal offshore gambling debts, and telling a doctor I was terrified of becoming a mother. The diagnostic codes, major depressive disorder and compulsive gambling, were laid out to look incredibly official. There were even prescription records for drugs I'd never taken and desperate quotes I'd never said. As a forensic accountant who spends her life ripping apart corporate fraud, I saw right through the disguise. Someone had spent months carefully crafting a chain of evidence designed to ruin my life in court with the single hit of an enter key. Section 3. Evidence of respondents' severe mental and financial instability. Subsection A. Evaluation by Dr. Helen Morrison, licensed clinical psychologist and addiction specialist. Dated November 12, 2025. I caught my breath. November 12th. I had never heard the name Helen Morrison in my entire life. The evaluation used an incredibly professional letterhead. Boston Back Bay Psychological and Behavioral Center, 412 Newbury Street, Suite 304. I read the first paragraph. Patient Clara Harrington presented for initial evaluation on November 12, 2025. Patient exhibited extreme anxiety, admitting to a loss of over $2 million in offshore online casino accounts, which she hid from her spouse. Patient appeared disheveled, showed flat affect, and expressed severe resistance to the upcoming motherhood. I had never stepped foot on Newbury Street for therapy, and I had never touched offshore gambling. The diagnostic codes practically jumped off the page. F3 2.1 for moderate depression, and F6 3.0 for pathological gambling. The recommended prescription was 100 milligrams of sertraline daily, with lorazepam as needed. I hadn't touched any of it. Yet the session notes were terrifyingly detailed. Patient states, "I cannot handle this child. My financial hole is going to ruin everything." My hands shook so hard the paper rattled. "This is a forgery," I said, my voice sounding incredibly distant. "I've never met this person and I've never been to this address." My father's face stayed like stone. "The medical records are perfectly clear, Clara. Dr. Morrison has log entries for 12 weeks of sessions. Your denial fits right into the avoidance patterns she diagnosed. Gaslighting." The word flashed in my mind. Make the victim question their own sanity. Make them doubt concrete reality. I kept flipping through the pages. November 26th, December 10th, 3 detailed consultations. On those exact 3 days, I was working around the clock at a client's accounting firm. I could prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. "The affidavit doesn't specify the physical location of every consultation," Croft added, glancing at his notes. "But Dr. Morrison's credentials are—" "I don't give a damn about her credentials," I raised my voice. "I was never there." I kept reading and my stomach completely turned over. Section 4. Witness Testimony. 6 affidavits. 6 names I had never heard in my life. Jennifer Paulson. I witnessed Clara crying in a coffee shop in December 2025, stating she owed money to loan sharks and didn't want to have this baby. Mark Duca. Clara told me she made a huge mistake and that her marriage was built on a financial lie. Susan, Brian, Dorothy, all repeating the exact same script, with dates scattered across last fall and winter. The locations were all vague: coffee shops, grocery stores, parks. Every single page was notarized, looking completely flawless. "I don't know these people," I said through my teeth. "Who the hell is Jennifer Paulson?" "Ms. Paulson is a concerned local resident who happened to overhear your breakdown in a coffee shop on December 18th, Croft said, looking a little uncomfortable now as he glanced at my father. "Which coffee shop?" "The affidavit doesn't specify." Of course it didn't. I flipped to page 15 and my breath stopped entirely. Supporting Declaration of Eleanor Harrington. 2 full pages, with my mother's actual signature at the bottom. Dated March 1st, 2026, 2 weeks ago. Notarized right in the public office downstairs from my father's private law firm. I looked up at her. She was crying now, silent tears rolling down her heavily made-up face. "Mom," my voice cracked, "you actually signed this garbage." She didn't answer. She just stood there crying, gripping that Hermes bag like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing onto the floor. I read her statement. "Over the past year, I have personally witnessed my daughter's mental health and financial stability completely unravel. She has become increasingly isolated, rejecting family support, and showing a pathological anger toward her father and me. I am deeply terrified for my grandson's physical safety and the risk of her squandering the Harrington family trust." "You haven't seen me in 3 years," I said, my voice turning incredibly cold, calm, and quiet. "You didn't show up to my wedding. You didn't even call me when I told you I was pregnant. Now you sign a legal document claiming you personally witnessed my breakdown?" "Clara, please," her voice shattered. "Please what?" I turned to my father. "You did this. You forced her to sign it." He didn't even deny it. He just stared at me with that cold, calculating look, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Your father said it was the only way to save you," my mother whispered, sobbing into the silence. "To save me." I let out a dry, sarcastic laugh that didn't even sound like my own voice. By stealing my baby and his trust fund, that's how you save me? I looked back down at the very last page of the petition. Given the respondent's current post-surgical vulnerability, medicated state, and lack of adequate familial support, petitioners request immediate temporary custody and conservatorship. An emergency transfer is required to protect the minor from foreseeable harm. The wall clock read 4:11 p.m. Marcus was still stuck on the top floor. I was completely alone, and my own parents had just casually announced they were taking my son. My father had been planning this for 7 months. I finally saw it clearly now. It all went back to last August, the exact second I told them I was pregnant, and he sent that ice-cold email. We need to discuss what arrangement is best for this child. No congratulations, no joy, just a calculated opening statement. I thought it was just standard Arthur Harrington arrogance, a pathetic attempt to control me from afar. I deleted the email, blocked his work address, and assumed that was the end of it. But he was working in the dark, forging medical logs, building a case that looked bulletproof on paper. 4 months of fake doctors, fake witnesses, fake debts. How do you argue against a trap made just for you? How do you prove something never happened? I tried to sit up, but the staples ripped at my skin. A sharp, blinding pain shot right through my lower stomach. The morphine took the edge off the surface, but it couldn't touch the deeper ache. I took a deep breath, and my forensic instinct kicked right in. You paid people to fake medical and financial records, I said, staring him dead in the eye. That is a federal felony. Wire fraud across state lines, perjury, conspiracy. You're looking at real prison time. These documents are completely legitimate, my father said, his voice not even wavering. Total, unshakable confidence. Dr. Morrison is a licensed professional. Who is she? I shot back, refusing to blink. Because I am going to find out. The second I prove you manufactured this, I am pressing charges. I will personally see to it. Try me. For the absolute first time, a tiny crack showed on his face. It wasn't fear, but he was definitely recalculating. Clara, he said, leaning forward just a fraction. Look at yourself. You just had major surgery, you're pumped full of narcotics, and you are entirely alone. Your husband isn't here. You have zero leverage in this building. A judge is only going to look at the facts. A judge is going to look at a desperate con artist who forged medical records to steal his grandson's trust fund. We aren't stealing a damn thing. His voice finally snapped, turning harsh. We are protecting the Harrington bloodline from a mother who is completely incapable of raising him. You made your bed, Clara. You married a nobody lawyer with zero backing, and you cut yourself off from this family. You've proven time and time again you have zero judgment. And now, Marcus is the executive vice president and chief legal counsel for Northeast Healthcare Alliance. He sits on the board of directors for this exact hospital. The words flew out of my mouth before I could even think. My father blinked. It was the first time in my 32 years on Earth I had ever seen genuine, unscripted shock on his face. He's what? My husband. The man you never bothered to ask about. The man whose last name you couldn't even say without curling your lip. He is the head legal counsel for the parent company that owns this entire hospital. And, by the way, because of my background, I've served as a financial consultant on this hospital's independent audit committee for the last 5 years. Croft's head snapped up. My father's jaw went completely rigid. That has nothing to do with this case, my father bluffed, trying to hold his ground. Doesn't it? I looked over at Croft. You had absolutely no idea, did you? He didn't tell you what my husband actually does or who owns this building, did he? Croft's total silence told me everything I needed to know. This conversation is over, my father said, suddenly standing up. Clara, we will be back with a judge's order and the proper authorities. In the meantime, I cut him off, my voice dropping to a chill. Get the hell out of my room. We're going to go see our grandson. He turned on his heel and started marching toward the door, heading for the nursery hallway. My mother scurried right behind him, clutching that luxury diaper bag. They had envisioned this whole thing playing out perfectly. Croft scrambled to pack his files. Mr. Harrington, I need to advise you this isn't standard protocol. The petition is filed, my father barked over his shoulder. I have a legal basis for custody. He was already at the door. I tried to lift myself up, but my body just gave out. My legs wouldn't work. The block was fading, but I was just too weak. I slammed the morphine button in pure desperation, but nothing happened. My father pulled the heavy door open. And Sarah Jenkins, the hospital's director of risk management and head nurse, was standing right there in the doorway blocking his path. Sarah is 50 years old, with 30 years of medical experience under her belt. 20 years ago, she was an attending physician at another hospital in the city, back when my mother was a resident. Right up until Arthur Harrington marched into the ER one day, threw a massive fit, and forced my mother to resign on the spot for family appearances, completely killing her medical career. "I remember you, Mr. Harrington," Sarah said. Her voice was perfectly professional and neutral, but there was a wall of pure steel underneath it. My father didn't even look her in the eye. "Move aside, I'm going to see the baby." "I'm sorry, but I need to check Mrs. Vance's vitals right now." Sarah walked right past him into the room, expertly placing her body between him and the hallway, completely cutting off the route to the nursery. She stepped up to my bedside and smoothly wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm. Her movements were calm, but her eyes were as sharp as a hawk. The cuff inflated. 98/64. "Elevated pressure. Tachycardia," Sarah said calmly, checking my lines. Her hand casually rested over the nurse's station terminal next to my bed. My father made another move toward the door. A wave of pure panic hit me. If they made it to the nursery right now while Marcus was still trapped upstairs and flashed those forged court papers, they could walk out with Leo before anyone knew what happened. I could see the nursery security backing down, the nurses handing my baby over. The thought made me physically sick. I could practically hear their footsteps echoing down the hall toward my son, each step crushing my chest. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, typing a quick command. I caught a glimpse of a bright red alert flashing on the screen. "Security dispatch. Room 412 VIP recovery. Immediate family disruption. Code pink pre-alert. Timestamp, 4:10:17 p.m. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at my father. She just logged the data, submitted it, and stepped back. "I'm going to need everyone to stay inside this room for the time being," she said, her voice a model of absolute calm. My father ignored her completely, taking another step into the hall. My mother trailed behind, bag in hand. Croft just froze by the window, his briefcase half open. 15 seconds. 35 seconds. I couldn't stop counting down the time in my head. 58 seconds. The elevator at the end of the hall gave a sharp, crisp ding. 73 seconds. The heavy thud of tactical boots. The crackle of radio static. 89 seconds. 2 fully armed hospital security officers rounded the corner. Michael, the head of security, stepped into the room. He was a former Marine MP who had been with the healthcare network for a decade. "Clara," he said, his tone instantly switching to pure concern the second he saw me. He used my first name. He knew exactly who I was. My father was forced to stop dead in his tracks. Michael reached over and picked up the emergency custody petition from the nightstand, where my father had left it thinking the game was already won. Michael ran his eyes over the cover, flipped to page 2, and stopped right on the line for spouse of respondent. I watched his entire face shift. "Wait a second," Michael said. "Marcus Sterling? Chief Legal Counsel Sterling?" The other security officer stepped up to the doorway. "Clara, Mr. Sterling is—" "He's in Executive Boardroom 1 on the top floor," I said, my voice completely raspy. Sarah, who had been watching the whole thing play out, took a step forward. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice dropping to a chill. "Before you filed this petition, were you aware that your son-in-law is the executive vice president of the entire healthcare conglomerate that owns and operates this hospital?" A fast, messy blur of expressions crossed my father's face over the next few seconds. Confusion, sudden realization, and a deep, unspoken panic. Croft finally spoke up, his throat sounding incredibly dry. "I was not given this information when I took on this client." My mother's hand snapped up to cover her mouth. The Hermes diaper bag hit the oak floor with a heavy thud. Michael was already barking into his radio. "Dispatch, this is Security 1, inside VIP Recovery 412. Code red override. Patch through to the top floor boardroom immediately. Cut right into Mr. Sterling's meeting. Tell him it's an absolute emergency." The radio crackled with static. Outside the door, a few other nurses and doctors started gathering in the hallway watching. The radio buzzed back. "Copy that, Security 1. Mr. Sterling has walked out of the merger meeting. He's on his way down. Estimated time, 3 minutes. My father sank heavily into the visitor's chair. For the first time since he had swaggered into the room, he went completely, utterly silent. Marcus got the call at exactly 4:12 p.m. The $2 billion acquisition was right at the final signing stage. Room 412. Emergency with your wife and child. He didn't say a single word to the board. He just dropped his pen and sprinted out of the room. He didn't even waste time waiting for the executive elevator. He hit the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, flying down 3 flights of stairs. At 4:15 p.m., the door was slammed open. Marcus strode into the room. He was wearing a custom navy Tom Ford suit, his tie already pulled loose, his usually perfect hair slightly messed up. At 38, he carried the kind of cold, imposing authority that comes from years of running the show at the highest level. His eyes scanned the room in a split second. Me, the security chief, an old, wealthy-looking couple, and a sweating lawyer. He walked straight to my bedside, completely ignoring everyone else. His large hand cupped my cheek, checking my temperature, while his other hand wrapped around my wrist to feel my pulse. "I'm here," he said, his voice incredibly low, meant only for me. "Are you okay? What happened?" The tears I'd been holding back for hours finally spilled over. I gripped his wrist tightly. "They're trying to take Leo. They're trying to freeze the trust." Marcus's jaw went completely rigid. It was the exact look he got right before he tore an opponent to shreds in a courtroom. He turned around to face the rest of the room. Michael handed him the 60-page petition. Marcus spent a solid minute flipping through the pages. The room was dead silent. His expression didn't change at all, but I knew him better than anyone. I could see the tiny tightening of the muscles in his shoulders. I could feel the absolute storm brewing inside him. He snapped the folder shut, looked up, and locked his eyes onto my father. "Mr. Harrington," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, carrying a weight that left zero room for argument. "I am going to need you to pack your things and get the hell out of my wife's room, right now." My father tried to stand up, desperately scrambling to salvage whatever dignity he had left. "Mr. Sterling, if you would just take a close look at these medical and financial records, you would see—" Marcus cut him off, his voice ice-cold and dead quiet. He didn't even need to raise it. "Michael, escort Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, and this so-called attorney, out of this building. I want an absolute federal restraining order filed against them within the hour. They are permanently banned from stepping foot in any facility owned by this conglomerate." He turned back to face me, completely erasing my father from the room. "It's over. I've got it from here." My father was still trying to argue, and Croft stepped forward, trying to explain that he had been left in the dark. Marcus didn't even give them a glance. "Michael," Marcus said, that was it, just one word. The eviction started exactly at 4:22 p.m. Up on the 4th floor of the VIP wing, dozens of nurses, doctors, department heads, and executives witnessed the entire thing. Everyone knew who I was. The whispers spread through the halls like wildfire. "Those are Clara's parents. They tried to steal the baby with forged papers." I lay there in bed, listening to the heavy footsteps and the crackle of radios fading down the corridor. This strange wave of pure humiliation mixed with absolute relief washed over me. My parents, the two people who had used their wealth and social standing to control every single second of my life, were now being marched out of the hospital like common trespassers, right in front of all my colleagues and friends. From room 412, past the central elevators, all the way down to the grand lobby on the 1st floor, and out the revolving glass doors. It was a solid 12-minute walk, and the security guards made sure it was incredibly slow and very public. Down in the main lobby, it was absolute peak hour for the shift change and visitors. The security footage later showed there were over 100 people in the lobby right then. Sarah walked right alongside the security detail, silently sending a perfectly clear message to the entire hospital. My father did everything he could to keep his spine straight and hold on to his precious old money pride, but he failed miserably. His face was pure stone. My mother was crying uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking violently as she kept her hand pressed over her mouth. Right before they reached the exit, Croft stopped dead in his tracks. "Officers, I want it on the record. I am officially withdrawing as counsel for these individuals." He turned to my father, his voice shaking with pure rage. "Arthur, you handed me fraudulent financial and medical logs. You almost got me disbarred in a federal court. We are completely done." With that, Croft turned around, walked over to the security desk, and volunteered to stay behind to give a formal statement to the hospital's legal team. The automatic doors slid open at 4:36 p.m. From the second they swaggered in to the moment they were kicked out like stray dogs, exactly 32 minutes had passed. As the glass doors closed behind them, My mother looked back one last time. Through the glass, her eyes locked with Sarah's from across the lobby. Sarah's expression didn't hold any victory or anger, just a deep, crushing sadness and disappointment. Over 20 years ago, Eleanor had been a brilliant young doctor with a massive future, and she gave it all up for that man. She chose wrong, and she kept choosing wrong. Sarah gave her a slow, subtle shake of her head and walked away. My mother completely collapsed against my father's side. He didn't comfort her, he just shoved her away. The doors shut for good. By 5:15 p.m., the head of Marcus's legal team arrived in the room with a couple of top investigators. Marcus was still sitting right by my side, gripping my hand tight. It only took the investigators 20 minutes to rip the whole fraud apart. Dr. Helen Morrison's medical license was actually revoked by the state of Massachusetts back in 2023 for medical fraud and extorting patients, the investigator reported. The so-called clinic on Newbury Street doesn't even exist. That address is just a UPS store. As for the Cayman Islands offshore accounts showing your gambling debts, those statements were photoshopped using a fake IP address and a copy of your expired passport. I felt this massive weight in my chest completely shatter. And there's more, the investigator continued. Out of those 6 witnesses, 4 of their social security numbers don't even exist. I just got off the phone with the other 2. They live out of state and are entirely willing to testify that Arthur Harrington paid them $5,000 each to sign those affidavits. Marcus nodded, his eyes flashing with a cold, dangerous light. This isn't a simple custody battle anymore. Wire fraud, falsifying federal medical records, perjury. Arthur Harrington isn't just going to go bankrupt, he's looking at least 10 years in a federal prison. Did we get the restraining order? The federal judge emergency issued it 10 minutes ago, the investigator said, handing over the paperwork. A strict 500-foot stay-away order. It covers you, Clara, and Leo. It's good for 2 years and can be renewed indefinitely. But that wasn't even all of it. Being a forensic accountant, I reached over and pulled the investigator's laptop onto my lap. I knew something felt off last month, so I quietly set up a backdoor audit script on my personal credit logs and medical files, I said, pointing at the data on the screen. Arthur Harrington's IP address tried to illegally access my bank records and medical logs 18 times over the last 2 months. He was using the servers from his real estate firm. Every single digital footprint is locked down. Marcus's grip on my hand tightened. Beautiful work, Clara. The investigator hesitated for a second, then pulled up a scanned file of an old court docket. We were doing a background check on the Harrington family history, and we stumbled on an old case. Suffolk County Superior Court, 1975. He turned the screen toward us. Arthur Harrington's father, your grandfather, filed a petition in 1975 for an emergency mental conservatorship over Arthur's younger sister, your aunt. The script was identical, accusing her of severe mental instability and substance abuse. The entire goal was to forcibly take over her share of the family trust fund. The legal battle dragged on for 3 years, and your aunt eventually had a real mental breakdown from the stress. She was put in an asylum, and they stripped her of every single cent. I stared at the screen. Arthur had been only 20 years old back then. He had watched his own father use the exact same legal playbook to brutally destroy his own sister. He learned the trick from his father, I whispered. The lingering numbness of the morphine felt like it turned into a deep, freezing chill in my bones. What my grandfather did to my aunt, my father was trying to do to me. 50 years of family history looping in a circle, that toxic logic of packaging absolute control and greed as love and protection. I looked over at Marcus, feeling this fierce, roaring strength take root in my chest. Leo was absolutely never going to grow up in that meat grinder. I was cutting the head off this snake today. Federal charges, restraining orders, prison time, and cutting ties for good. It's just a cycle of generational trauma, Marcus said softly, his hand gently rubbing the back of my neck to give me strength. In his twisted mind, he probably genuinely believed he was saving the family. Sarah quietly stepped back into the room. Eleanor was a phenomenal ER doctor back in the day, she sighed softly. She was supposed to go to the Mayo Clinic for a fellowship, but Arthur took everything from her. And now, because of him, she's completely lost her daughter and her grandson. The room fell dead quiet for a long time. First thing tomorrow morning, I'm handing all of this over to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Marcus broke the silence. But for tonight, Clara, They are completely gone from our world. Forever. I looked across the hallway toward the nursery doors. Can I please hold my son now? I asked. Sarah gave me a warm, gentle smile. I'll bring him right over. 3 days later, I was discharged, and we went home to our house just outside of Boston. Leo was cradled in my arms, and Marcus was driving smoothly through the steady New England spring rain. At 2:47 a.m. on our first night back, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text message. Clara, I am so sorry. I should have stopped him years ago. Eleanor. I stared at the screen for the longest time. Leo was breathing softly in his crib right next to the bed. Marcus was fast asleep beside me. I didn't reply. 2 weeks later, Marcus's legal team called with an update. The FBI had executed a raid on Arthur Harrington's real estate conglomerate, freezing every single one of his assets. That exact same morning, Eleanor Harrington officially filed for divorce. 6 weeks after that, a 4-page handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox. The postmark was from a tiny remote town up in Maine. I knew my mother's handwriting instantly. Marcus found me in the nursery while I was burping Leo over my shoulder. "What's it say?" he asked. I carefully folded the pages back up. She says she's in therapy twice a week. She's staying in her sister's old vacation house. She wrote that she finally realizes her silence all those years was an unforgivable sin. She's trying to find the young medical student she used to be. Does she want to see Leo? No. She said she isn't worthy of that yet. Maybe a long time from now, maybe never. How do you feel about it? Marcus asked, looking at me, then at our son, and at the life we had built with our own hands. I don't know, I said honestly. Ask me in a few years. 8 weeks down the road, I brought 2-month-old Leo back to the hospital. Not for work, just a social visit. The little guy had chunked up, getting nice and healthy, and he was finally starting to smile. The coffee bar in the main lobby still had that exact same comforting smell, a mix of cheap espresso beans and medical-grade hand sanitizer. Sarah was the first one to spot me. "Clara!" she called out, bringing over the whole department, nurses, doctors, members of the risk management team. Everyone was gently passing Leo around, making those sweet, adoring noises. Sarah handed me a cup of coffee with a splash of cream, no sugar. She always remembered exactly how I took it. She sat down right across from me. "How are you actually doing?" she asked softly. I took a moment to think about it. Really think about it. "Some days are still incredibly heavy," I said. "The trauma pops up out of nowhere sometimes. But I'm building something brand new. A life that is entirely my own." Sarah nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. "That is exactly what breaking a family curse looks like." I looked down at Leo, who had drifted fast asleep in Sarah's arms, safe, protected, and completely loved. I thought about my father, about that forged court file sitting in an evidence locker at a federal building gathering dust, and about the absolute restraining order that was still active. I thought about my mother, about her letter, and about how maybe, many years from now, after real boundaries and a lifetime of healing, there might be a tiny seed of forgiveness. I thought about that old 1975 case file, and how the vicious cycle that had haunted the Harrington family for 50 years had completely stopped dead in its tracks on this bright afternoon. It wasn't just because the bad guys lost, even though they lost absolutely everything. It was because I finally had the power to choose. I chose who got to be in my life, who got to hold my son, and who got to write my story. I made my choice. And that power, the absolute right to define who I am, what my family looks like, and what real love actually means, that is everything. My phone lit up with a text from Marcus. "Just wrapped up my meeting. I'll be down in the lobby to pick you guys up in 5 minutes. I smiled. Leo stirred in my arms, blinking his eyes open to look at me. I looked right back at my son. We were free. The absolute weight of everything didn't truly settle until our first night back home, while I was rocking Leo in the quiet, dark nursery. The terror of almost losing him was still there, throbbing like a fresh bruise, but beneath it was this brand new, unshakable strength. When I was trapped in that hospital bed, barely able to move, I used my mind and my skills to build an ironclad fortress around him. When everyone thought I should just bow down to their money and my own weakness, I chose myself, and I chose my new family. The shadows of that trauma might still roll in like the tide sometimes. I still dream about those footsteps in the hallway and the sound of that Hermes bag hitting the floor. But right alongside those dreams is the pure joy of watching Marcus at 3 in the morning, completely out of tune, humming a song while he bottles feeds our son. Maybe one day, I'll slowly let my mother back into my life. But it will have to be built on a foundation of ironclad boundaries and real proof that she has actually changed. But for now, I choose peace. I choose us. Nobody, not even the people who brought me into this world, will ever take away my power to choose again. It isn't just because the bad guys lost, it's because I won something so much better than revenge. I won back myself. And I won the absolute right to write the next chapter on my own terms.